Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and a very, very special and warm welcome to Jasmin, who is this month's author of The Bohemians. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Your book was well loved in our community. So many great things said, so many high ratings. And I mean, if you go to Goodreads, you can see her very, very high ratings. Which is something I do want to ask you this evening. I love to hear about authors and their reviews and if they actually, it's such a love-hate relationship. Before we start, before I hand over the reins to you, Jasmin, I'm going to read your biography here. And your last name, I'm going to work my way through. Jasmin Darznik, is that correct?
Perfect.
Perfect. Is the New York Times bestselling author of 3 books, including The Bohemians, a novel that imagines the freedom between photographer Dorothea Lange and her Chinese-American assistant in 1920s San Francisco. A New York Times Book Review Summer 2021 recommendation. The Bohemians is also one of Oprah's daily best books of historical fiction for 2021. She was born in Iran and came to America when she was 5 years old. She holds an MFA in fiction from Bennington College, JD from the University. Sorry.
No, it's okay. You don't have to read all that.
Oh, well, it's
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I interrupted.
No problem. A JD from the University of California and a PhD in English from Princeton University. Of course I have to read that. That's amazing. Hi, Mom. She is an associate professor and okay, my children, you need to go. And chair of the MFA program in writing at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. I'm so sorry, Jasmin.
Oh no, I get it.
I'm so sorry.
I've had a child, he's grown now, but now I take care of my mom and maybe she'll come into my room.
All right. Her 4th book, which we also want to delve into tonight, is a novel set in old Hollywood, and it's forthcoming from Valentine. When is it coming out?
Oh my gosh, I have to finish it first. So yeah. But working on it.
Perfect. Well, thank you again for joining us. And so the first question I always love to start out with, and then I can mute myself, which will be pleasant for everybody on here, is how did you get into writing? I mean, obviously you spend a lot of time at school studying it, but did you go straight into writing? Was there another career, or how did that work out?
Yeah, there were a lot of kind of false routes and mistaken paths, and I don't know, I guess it all kind of adds up, and you can't regret your mistakes entirely, right? But I didn't really start to write until I was in my mid-30s, and I mean writing with the intention of publishing. So I had, at college and growing up, I had always written mostly nonfiction, but I was headed toward I was in a PhD program and headed toward a life in academia when I started to write my first book, which was a memoir. And that experience of writing that book and publishing it put me on a different path. So that was, I guess, 10, 11 years ago now was the publication of the first book. And then since then, I've written the 2 others, but relatively later, I was in, like I say, my mid-30s, and there were a lot of, just sort of, I don't know, delays, doubts, so much. There wasn't a lot in my background. I came from an immigrant family, and there wasn't much support around doing anything in the arts or becoming a writer. There was just a lot of emphasis in my family on becoming sort of like the ideal immigrant, right? There's just a lot of pressure, I think, on immigrants, definitely in my family, to pursue something that's more solid, right? Something that's going to help care for the family. And so I first went to law school, and then I got that PhD, and it took a long time until I was able to sort myself out.
All good writers have a good story on how the page got published, I find.
Yeah, and they're all different, right? It's really interesting. I think it's very rare that I hear somebody. I mean, it's great when you do hear. I always knew I wanted to be a writer, and I just set on that course, and I had a lot of support. But it's much more typical to hear that people really had to fight for it, and through in themselves also to claim that.
Absolutely. And you just touched on it a bit, but this is your third book, but you wrote another book before this, and it was called The Good Daughter, and that was a memoir. And I read about it today, and I mean, it sounds incredible. And I would love for you to tell our members a little bit about it, because I feel like everybody's going to want to pick this up after they hear this.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Erin. Yeah, it's a memoir, so a family memoir. When I was in my 20s, I found out that my mother, who's Iranian, I was born in Iran, had been married and had a child before she married my father. So it's pretty complicated, but it's the story of a family secret and the revelation of that secret and the repercussions of my learning that about my mom. We spent a long time working on the project together. It was a book that I wrote alongside her, or she was really important to the writing of it. Um, it was a story she hadn't told anyone in 50 years, so it was not an easy process getting out. She had, maybe people know or don't know about Iran, but it's of course right now it's in the news so much, but she had been married really young when she was 13 and was in an abusive marriage. On the condition of getting a divorce was that she give up the child. So she had to, essentially like completely cut that out of her memory. One can't, I don't think she did, but no one spoke about it in the family. It was just forbidden. It was a forbidden topic. So she hadn't talked about it even with people who had known her for decades. And it was something she kept from me as well. So it was a really thorny, I mean, more than thorny, it was a real minefield going through that terrain of her memories. But that book made me a writer. It brought me a lot closer to my mother. It made me understand a lot about about why she was the way she was with me as I was growing up. Those kinds of experience, I think, really, they leave an imprint down through the generations, really. So it helped a lot to know that story, and it helped a lot to write it too.
Amazing. So ladies, if you want to grab that book, it's called The Good Daughter, and yeah, it's for sale.
Yeah, it is for
I
sale.
I don't have enough time. I need to go and get it right now and read it. I need to find out what happens.
What happens, how it ended. Yeah. And when you write a memoir, it's sort of, they're always a fiction in a way, because the story keeps going. You're always still trying to make sense of it. So it's definitely true to the experience as I understood it, but so much else has happened in the years since. One of the things that happened is that she now has Alzheimer's. So if I hadn't written that book with her or worked on it with her all those years ago, 10 years ago, I certainly couldn't do it now, because she doesn't remember anything. She really has just been stripped of all her memory. So I'm sort of the custodian now, and I'm really grateful to have, I have this book now that is forever, right? It's a sort of, wonderful thing to have, the story of your family, right? So in case anyone's sitting on a family story and you're not sure if you can or you should, I think it's important to try to tell these stories, because you just don't know if you're going to be able to tell this story later on.
Wow, fascinating. Ladies, just to reiterate, if you want to ask a question to Jasmin yourself, please feel free. There's the chat window, but we can also you can ask live if you like. That's always fun. Okay, now The Bohemians, which is the book. So everybody's read The Bohemians, so there's no spoilers here.
Okay.
Sorry?
Oh, I just said great.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think I talked at the same time as you, so anyways. So we've read a lot of historical fiction, and I feel like most of the historical fiction we've read are based on sort of events in historical settings, which are accurate, but not so many books are based on like a true life character like Dorothy was. And so I have a couple questions around that.
Sure.
And so how did you kind of find this woman to start with, and what about her really spoke to you?
Sure. I first fell in love with the building. So since you've all read the book, when I say monkey block, you know what I'm talking about. I just fell in love with that building, and I was just committed to writing something about that book. I started scouting around, and I found Dorothea Lange actually through her first husband, Maynard Dixon, who had been part of that Bohemian set in San Francisco in the 1920s. I knew just because it's what most interests me, that I wanted to write about a woman. So it was really, to me, that was one of the qualifications. And then I wanted it to be an artist, because that's also something that interests me a lot. The development of a woman artist is, to me, just such fascinating subject. And then I think the thing that clinched it, I mean, before the thing that clinched it, another thing that really started to push me in that direction of Dorothea Lange was Lange's work itself. So I knew Lange's work. I knew her work through the Depression. I was totally surprised to learn that she had been a photographer in San Francisco in the 20s, because you only ever really hear about her work in the Depression during the 30s. So this was just such a different side of her, really. And then the thing that clinched it, so to come to the place that clinched it, is the reference to her Chinese American assistant. And it was just a paragraph in the biography, but I just thought it was so very interesting that she chose to have a Chinese American assistant. That detail, one of the few details about this woman, was that she'd grown up in a mission home. That I had never heard of that term before. I was really intrigued. What was that? And then it, as happens with writers, it just kind of started to take over, and at a certain point, you don't even feel like you're making the choices anymore. You pledged yourself, somehow you just get curiouser and curiouser, and there you are, so engrossed in their story, you have to tell it.
A lot of the conversations we have with historical fiction writers is about like accuracy. And so I
Mhm.
wonder sort of like what role does accuracy play when we're talking about a real life human?
Yeah,
Obviously deceased now, but
it's so complicated, and everybody wants to know. I think I want to know too. If I read something based on a real historical person, I am curious how much was made up, how much is true, right? I think that if you're going to write a novel, it has to be something that history or biography can't do or didn't do, right? So I think if you're only seeking to retell a story that already exists in a nonfiction form, at least for me, I'm not excited about a project like that. I need something where there's something mysterious, something incomplete, something shadowy about the life or the person. So with Lang, it was, this period of her life that was somewhat obscure, Lang in the 1920s in San Francisco, and then this relationship that was also somewhat, kind of, it was sort of neglected by history and seemed really rich, with potential for imagining. I think I think to myself that if Lang were to come back, this is kind of the litmus test, if she were to come back, that I would want her to recognize herself in the story. So she might not like it, she might not a lot of people don't like being written about, so maybe she wouldn't like that, but I would hope that she could see the resemblance between herself and the Dory that I created, right? Some of what I do is sort of pulling out from, how did I describe this? It's almost like, um, for example, looking at Lang's work, she was so interested and so devoted to writing about people who had been forgotten or kind of neglected, right? And so it's, part of what just got really exciting was, in a sense, turning that same spirit onto Lang's story and her assistant's story, right? So something about that felt, if not there, it's not yeah, it's an invention, but it just felt in keeping with who she was and the kind of art that she created. So that also became an important consideration. Was I creating something that was in the spirit of this woman and the beautiful work that she did?
well, I mean, it was a fascinating story, and I'm sure this is the same as a lot of people that like they went on to Google like all of her photography.
Yeah.
I even wrote in the entry in the paragraph that announced the book in our newsletter just how I'd spent so much time Googling after I had read it.
I
But
love that.
yeah, Barrelheads. Well, I mean, I think any book that sort of invokes you to do further research has really done its job, right?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think a lot of times we want to know, but we want to know more about history, or especially as women, we want to know about women from history, but we're not always going to reach for a history book to get that. So how wonderful that a novel makes you curious and a novel makes you hungry for more. I love that myself when I'm reading. So I love to hear that you had that experience.
Absolutely. My next question about that was, oh, I think I already asked that. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Let's talk about Maynard for a minute here, because Caroline did not like Maynard, but she kind of like, now I'm delving right into the plot here.
Yeah, I've heard
She
it.
kind of just like bit her tongue. But I mean, it sort of worked and it sort of didn't. Is that like, do you think that was like a really true, like, how much did you find out about their relationship, and like, because he was a lot older than her, and so like, do you think that
Yeah.
you wrote it like very true to how
I
it was?
did. I did. I absolutely did. I mean, I guess this goes with your question is, I won't take liberties with what I know to be true. So if most of the historical accounts, biographical accounts have written this as a complicated relationship, with all this sort of tensions, and the main kind of points of tension between the two are drawn right from reality, or what I could find. Um, so it's more that you take, let's say, there's a scene with where I think the stepdaughter. So it's been a few years, so I forgot I forget some things. But I finished the book a year and a half before it ever even comes out. So it's been about 3 years at this point. But the stepdaughter.
Conci.
Thank you so
Consuela.
much, Peter. So I knew, I had read in Dorothea Lange's biography that Maynard would leave Conci with Dorothea, and just sort of disappear. And then it becomes my job as a novelist to imagine a scene. So where was he? Where would Conci have gone? What would it have invoked in Dorothea? How would she have reacted? How would the scene play out? And it's more like you're trying to see it as it might have happened in your mind, right? And then to translate that back onto the page. So it's taking something that's summary and bringing it into scene and making it story. That's the invention. But it's always, I think, mostly it's really pulling from what was true. And definitely with Dory, I think he was probably worse than I could even make him, because and this is hard when you're writing historical fiction, because I, like Caroline, I would have liked a different partner for Dorothea, but that's who Dorothea Lange chose. And so you have to make I had to sort of make myself fall in love with Maynard and make the reader fall in love with Maynard in order to then feel the disappointment later on, right? I mean, you can't come right out of the gate saying he was a terrible person. He has to have some, even if you see the writing on the wall, hopefully like it comes across that he was really alluring to Dorothea because he was older and an artist and all these things. But on the other hand, it's like with someone like Maynard, who disappointed Dorothea Lange so many times, I mean, had I tried to chronicle that true to life, it would have been unbearable to read, So you got to just sort of choose your episodes and then move on and explore other facets of her life.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the whole you cringe so much through the relationship, especially with the stepdaughter and having to look after her and her hating her, and I felt her
It's like
pain.
a hothouse environment, right? And even knowing, as I found out, I realized that they were living in an earthquake shack, which if you don't know San Francisco history, you might not know, but after the earthquake in 1906, there were these little tiny one-room shacks set up, and they were always meant as temporary housing. They weren't. There's still some in existence, actually, 100 and some years on. But all of this drama between Dorothea and Maynard and Conzi, all of this was going down in this tiny shack, so imagine how much worse it would have been. And so, the research reveals and kind of gives you these dimensions. And then really thinking about, oh my gosh, even just the physical space would have made the situation intolerable, right?
So the San Francisco in the 1920s, that was almost like its own character, like Monkey Block. And so how did you do the research from that
Mhm.
portion of the book? And I'm sorry, there's noise in the background. Did you visit where it was or where it once stood?
Yeah, I knew about it from a student who was working. I had a graduate student who's working on a nonfiction project about Monkey Block. That was the first I'd ever heard about it. In her project, she had mentioned that it stood where the Transamerica Pyramid is. So that's like that's one of the icons in San Francisco. It's that pyramid shape. It seems small now. There are much taller buildings, but at the time it was built, it was a real transformation to go from this artist colony to this kind of beacon of capitalism. Was really a violent rupture of San Francisco history. So I knew where it was. I knew that it wasn't there anymore. I was just smitten with the building. I was able to go to the San Francisco Public Library, which has really extensive, just beautifully robust collection of materials about San Francisco history. So I was able to hold the deed to Montgomery Block in my hands, and to read oral histories with people who had lived in the building at the time. And all of this, you can't just Google your way to it. So definitely a huge advantage that I was near San Francisco as I was writing the book, and I had access to these archival materials. Um, and then I think a lot of the other places I knew Chinatown some, but I had to go back and visit. Chinatown is really very similar to how it was 100 years ago, so it's actually stayed a lot like that time. Um, anyway, it did occasion some field trips.
Those are always the best though, of course.
Yeah, and I love research. It's to me, it's the best part.
So Caroline was the Beryl actually writes here, she felt like Caroline had a more important role rather than being an assistant, and she liked her strong character. Um,
Mhm.
Caroline was a really strong character, also given like the amount of racism that like she existed sort of like like around her, obviously. How was she based on any other sort of historical fiction or not historical fiction, but historical person? Or was you just had that sort of like really small bits of information and then she came to life?
Yeah, I mean, I really do take the task of research really seriously. So I had this one clue was the mission home, and there were books written about that particular home in San Francisco. The woman who ran it, Donaldina Cameron, she had produced some autobiographical, just not memoir, but there were materials about her. But I also wanted to I mean, it's really hard. You can put the costumes on a character, but to get into the psyche, what would it really have felt like for a woman of color to walk through the streets of San Francisco in 1918? That's You can't just do that by telepathy, right? So I do try to find anything that can just give me some clues, that can give me something to hold on to and build out from. I found the memoirs of two sisters. They were actually Canadian. Their last name was Eaton, Eaton, I think is how it's spelled. They were two sisters who were born in Montreal, and they both traveled widely. The one sister, and they were biracial, so they were half Chinese and half English, raised in Canada. One of the sisters becomes the grandmother of Asian American literature. She takes on a Chinese name, totally adopts that identity. The other sister passed as Japanese. And since they were both writers, they both left records of their life. And reading those was a very interesting way of getting a perspective of what it would have meant to be biracial at this time in history, right? And the fact that you could have two sisters go such divergent paths was really fascinating. And it made me think of it made me think of Caroline, or the character that would become Caroline in a different way, is when you have her in the studio with Dory and she's sort of playing a role. I was harnessing some of that information that I gleaned from the Eaton sisters, right? That there was also a way that a woman in that situation could kind of manipulate people, because she would always be suspect to stereotypes, and people would all, but there would also be a kind of resistance, right? I just imagined that that it could have been, I mean, that there could have been these ways that she also was really playing with identity, and she was powerful in ways that the people looking at her couldn't understand and couldn't register, right? So anyway, just to give you just a little bit of how I went about creating Caroline, a lot of it, of course, I had to feel my way through, but like I say, it was important to have some historical, kind of sisters out there to guide me.
Oh, that's so interesting about the sisters in Canada.
Yeah, really, these are just, these kind of rabbit holes you could go down forever, right? Like they could have been a whole novel of their own, and then nearly every woman in this really deserves her own novel. So it becomes difficult.
Well, there are some other big names, and I don't have them written down, unfortunately, but in the book, the photographer and the news, and I forget their names now, and I hate that. But were those based on real life people?
They're all real. I mean, really, if I use their name, they're real. So Consuelo Kanaga was real. And Imogen Cunningham was real, and Ansel Adams was real. And if their name is there, it's based on a true story. And again, like I'm really trying to go with the grain of history. There's the scene with Ansel Adams and Dory. It's basically, it stages a conversation that they were lifelong friends, and it's an argument they had to the end of their lives, which is basically, what's the point of photography, right? And it was just so much fun imagining them young together for the first time, and just kind of like having that argument for the first time.
Well, I thought it was so cool to have them in there too, and to be able to learn like little tidbits about them as we went. So Beryl wants to know if Caroline had have any family in France after she moved, and obviously she says, "I understand that part was fiction."
I know, it's funny because I don't know. I mean, you think I might know because I created her, right? But I have thought, and I would love at some point to do a sequel in which I tell Caroline's story from the time that she arrives in France to some point in her future. I have embedded the book with a few little breadcrumbs for myself. I'm not going to tell you all of them, but they're a couple of little things that I think I left in there for a possible sequel. Some hints and clues of mysteries that only really could be understood later in a telling from her vantage point. But I don't know. I don't know if she has family. I think she might.
Kim wants to know, she's just never having heard of Monkey Block. Did that name have any significance?
Well, it was based on Montgomery Block, and I don't know who came up with it first, but I think you get something of the feeling of what a kind of wacky place it was. I think there's a description of it from the late 19th century, where it's like, this is, it's like a zoo in there. There's a description that this place is just like chaotic, and all the things that you kind of imagine an artist colony would be like. And so it's a made up name, but I think it was also playing on the kind of whimsy and creative energy that was alive in that place.
Marisol wants to know, how was Dorothea as a mother? Was she close to her children?
Yeah, that could have been a whole other book. So the book stops, and that's a hard choice. You have to decide, like, how are you gonna make the story end? You can't tell the whole story because that would be another 300 pages. She was very conflicted as a mother, and I have thought often that when you see, if you haven't seen Migrant Mother, Google it later, but you probably, most people can kind of conjure Migrant Mother in their heads. But that woman who is so beleaguered and determined, but also, just clearly in such crisis, I read as a self-portrait. I think that Lang really saw herself in that woman. I think she, in her own life, in that moment, I think she felt she had recently divorced from Maynard. All the responsibility of their two sons was on her. They really resented her far more than they did Maynard, even though he was a lot more negligent. I mean, he was just gone for huge tracts of their childhood, but they really blamed her. And so I think it was really complicated. I think she's, she probably at a certain point, her ambition became such that it was really hard to be a mother in that kind of traditional, baking the cookies kind of way. And so definitely people come to me and say, she was a terrible mother. Why didn't you put that in there? And yeah, I I guess I could say it's just complicated. Let's see, I'm reading in the chat. There's a semi-rift in our book club about the role of mothers. Yeah, the issue of foster services. So this is 1930, 1932, 35, excuse me, is when Dorothea Lange had her first child. During the Depression, there was no childcare. She was a working class woman. There's no childcare available. And I think when we hear the word foster care now, I think it just had a different meaning then. I think a lot of people who were strapped and didn't have family to take care, help them take care. Not a lot, but it was a somewhat common practice to kind of place your children out for periods of time when you couldn't take care of them, right? So she did that, and I think it, from our vantage point in history, it really rubs us the wrong way, because maybe we're even hard. I think maybe we might be even harder on mothers now than people were then. Discuss among yourselves.
Speaking of mothers, my children are screaming in the background. Sorry. Joanne has a really good question here. She wrote, I was so intrigued by Dorothea Lange that I viewed some of her photos online and read the novel Learning to See by Elsie Hooper. She had photos in her book and on the cover, and she's interested to know your decision not to include photos. Did you think that they would have taken away from the fictional aspect?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it's pretty it's not, at least in America, it's not you don't see pictures in novels, even if they are based on people, because I think, really you want to, as a publisher, really standing for, this is a work of the imagination. And I think it can confuse readers if there's too much of that intrusion into the text, right? Like if you have that, even if it's based on characters. So it's really not, it's not done. It's also really expensive to reproduce pictures. You have to deal with the estate and so forth. The reason that book, Learning to See, has Dorothea Lange on the cover is that she was working for the government at that time, and all those pictures are in the public domain, right? So they actually belong to Americans, and that's why you see Dorothea Lange's images reproduced, but that is only with respect to those pictures she took. That wouldn't have applied to her family portrait, her pictures that she took of her own family. So I didn't think there was a need. And also nowadays, really, if you're curious, you can really do that work. And it's actually really, I think it's really fun and adds a dimension as you're reading to go sleuthing for it yourself.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for all the information on the book and the characters. Oh, Renata, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I wanted to know, do you read your reviews, and do you read what people say, like on Goodreads and stuff like that?
When you're first waiting there, like I said, you finish your book a year or a year and a half before it ever comes out. And there's this period of time where no one has read the book and you're so anxious, you're really actually, all you really want to hear is that everybody loves it. I mean, in my house, when I give my book to my husband, he's not allowed to have an opinion other than it's wonderful. So when authors go looking, I think it's a lot of times because we're just insecure, we don't know. We've made this thing, a long time has gone by, we did the best we could, but we're not sure. And it can be really devastating to read a bad review early, right? And I have gotten better over time. So this is my third book. And I know that about myself. I know like it's really going to upset me if someone doesn't give me like, it's just it's hard. It's really, really hard. Maybe someday I'll become like a stronger person, but so far I just have to stay away from it. So I don't go delving a lot, especially after, after it comes out and they're starting to get like, you start to get some reviews and publications and so forth. It's like, and I for sure believe it's a bad decision to go into Goodreads and try to interact with just bad form and not good for you as a writer. I feel like that belongs to readers, right? And we shouldn't even really, I don't even think we really should be in there. So I don't go to Goodreads at all. Amazon is harder to avoid because I order stuff from Amazon. I don't even use Goodreads really, but I'm on Amazon all the time. And if I do check every once in a while, and you can get 700 5 stars, and that one will just attach itself like a leech to your soul and just start sucking. you know
A
um,
quick follow on.
yeah.
What books do you recommend by
Oh,
other
I have
writers?
so many. So on my website, I've got this page called favorites, and I list my 10 favorite books of all time. So there's that. And among them is I love Sarah Waters, who wrote a novel called Tipping the Velvet. She's an English novelist who writes historical fiction. Love her work. Paula McLean's Paris Wife is a book that was just really, to me, it really opened up the possibilities of writing about someone from history. That's about Hemingway's first wife. And I read a lot of nonfiction. I actually prefer nonfiction. I love memoir. I love history as well. So in my top 10, I've got a few memoirs and history books in the mix too. Last book I love that I read that I recommend is Mercury Pictures Presents by Anthony Mara. That just came out and I loved it.
Thank you, Renata, for your question. We actually have another live question. Jill wants to ask one.
Hi. So it's kind of comment questions, but the one thing that I was gonna maybe ask for your feedback about was I got the impression, I don't know, maybe self-servingly, because I am a woman that doesn't choose to have children, that maybe Dorothy or Dory like could have had more choices, that maybe she would have chosen to live a different way. So when the end part came about where she had the 2 boys and there were some like separation and the caregiving option, all the questions, I always just wondered if like, I don't know, if she would have chosen the parenting path for herself, if she had been given more opportunities, and just what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah. She had a really strained relationship with her own mother. I don't think it came naturally to her. I don't know that I think, probably your intuition or your hunch is right there, is if she were living in different times. I think in in that time, and not until, still, some people still think this is, it's like unnatural for a woman not to want to have children, right? I think in her lifetime, that was definitely the mindset. I think she was also young and in love with her husband and made a mistake, I made that mistake. I got married pretty young and I just didn't have a sense of what parenthood entailed. And by the time I was facing it, I had to deal with it. I haven't had more children, but I think somewhere between something between her temperament and the times, had they been different, suggests to me that, and also I think if she had had a more solid sense of herself as a professional, it's only really in the 30s, in her 30s and the 30s, that she started, she started to do documentary photography, and she really came into her own, right? And I think that really heightened the conflict in her. In her 20s, when she had her kids, I think she thought of her work more like, I'm supporting my family. It's not really my art, right? But as she gets into her 30s and then 40s, it's a mission. She's really feeling the heat of her own ambition and her ideals in her work, and that also, had she felt that earlier, maybe she wouldn't have had children. I don't know, but when she did, it really, really made it hard.
Yeah, sorry, that was kind of very hypothetical. My next one kind of is too, but I was also gonna say, so rabbit holing on all of these real people, because you just like immediately when you read books like this, you just like Wikipedia rabbit everyone. And the thing that surprised me a lot was that the migrant mother never received like any financial compensation for being one of like the most, I mean, her likeness was used in one of the most reproduced photos of all time. And upon her death, they were like raising money just for her like care. And I thought that was really interesting. And it kind of reminded me a lot of like the Henrietta Lacks story with like hotels and the things.
That's so great. Yeah.
And like the ethics behind like when people use something from someone else and then and I know that Dorothea didn't, or she also didn't benefit because I think she was working for the WPA or something at the time, but I just think it's also, I don't know, it gives me like the not great vibes to hear that someone's likeness has been reproduced, and I don't know. So I thought that was interesting and I learned a lot from this, and thank you for writing it. I appreciate it.
If I have a minute, I mean, one of the ironies with Migrant Mother is that Lang was given a mandate to only photograph white women, right? I mean, she was told, because her work, she was working for the government, and the point of all that work was to underwrite the programs like the FDR, all of the New Deal work, and they felt that if white Americans believed that all of, that this money would be going to people of color, they wouldn't endorse those policies or those laws and programs. And so she was told explicitly to only photograph white people. To her, kind of eternal credit, she didn't listen to them. She took pictures of whoever interested her. But I don't think she knew that Florence Thompson was Indian, Native American. I don't think she knew that when she took the picture. She probably didn't know it for a long time, and it came out later that that was a case. But isn't that just like such a ironic, sad reflection of America, that this woman who is emblematic of, our nation's great, women and all of that, is a woman of color who probably, if the government had known that she was Native American, they wouldn't even allowed for that photograph to get pictured and, get taken in the first place. So there's so much there. I think it's really a doozy. Sorry, Jill, Lang didn't even want, this is the problem when you talk to me, is I just don't stop talking, is Lang didn't, toward the end of her life, when she had that retrospective at the MoMA just before she died, she didn't even want to include Migrant Mother. She was like, she just felt like it had come to stand for all of her work, and it was just, it had been overused and, maybe abused, and she didn't even want to include it. And MoMA really insisted on its inclusion in that exhibition. So, but I think that's so interesting because it really is the one work that we associate with Lang, and she was really over it as well, herself.
So we're running out of time, but we do want to hear two very important things, and that's number one is what you're working on next and when we can look forward to it. I know you said you had to finish writing it.
Yeah. I became chair of my academic department, and it has totally come up for air. I am working on a novel about Rita Hayworth in old Hollywood, so 1930s, 40s Hollywood. Also just a really fascinating, and I'm, also I'm also working on, these days I'm working on some nonfiction pieces in translation in support of the protests in Iran. So that's also absorbing a lot of my. Bohemians was my it was my American book, and I really felt like I wanted to show that I wasn't just about Iran, because you do get pigeonholed as a writer, but I feel really a great pull and kind of a responsibility right now. So I'm not writing fiction about Iran anymore, but I'm trying to lend my voice in ways that I can to that.
Absolutely. I guess you did give us a couple of recommendations already as well that we should read, but if you have any like all-time favorite books, all-time favorite novels, please do share those. We always love to hear what you've read recently or what you've just read 100 times.
Yeah, I read a great nonfiction book. It's called Kiki Man Ray, and it's about, I'm just intoxicated by Paris in the 20s, and it's about a woman who's a very famous model at the time, but she was also an interesting artist in her own right. And that is by an author named Mark Broad. And the book is called Kiki Man Ray. Wonderful. It's about 200 pages, so it's a pretty quick read. And someone said they'd love to hear me write about Iran. And the good news is I have already written 2 books about Iran. And you know what? It's actually kind of sad, but I guess it's interesting because I've gone back and looked at those 2 books, and so much of what we're seeing is part of a really long story. And women have been fighting for human rights and women's rights for so long in Iran that both those books could be pretty instructive if you're interested in what's going on in Iran. It could give you some insight. So what can I say? I recommend them. Yeah, they're called The Good Daughter and Song of a Captive Bird. The second one's a novel.
Yeah, why don't you just give us a few lines about, because I'm sure that like this is like, as you say, like so pertinent and timely, and I'm sure our readers want to know more. If you can just give us a few sentences a bit. We've heard about the memoir, but about and I'm not going to say the title right, so go ahead.
It's just Song of a Captive Bird, and that's about a poet, also like similar to Bohemians. It's a person who lived. She's like Iran's rock star, feminist, badass poet, and she died under somewhat mysterious circumstances in 1967. So that novel is a story of her life and her writing and her really transgressive behavior. She was writing about sex and politics and the environment in Iran in the 50s and 60s. So she was a real firebrand, really fascinating woman. So that's the novelization of her life in that book. Someone asked me where they can find my top 10 book recommendations that are not my own books. And that's, if you go to my website, there's a tab on the top that reads favorites. Erin, maybe later on I could put this in an email to you. But on that page, if you scroll down a bit, it'll say my top 10 favorite books. I'm also pretty active on Instagram, and I'm always sharing books I love on there. If you want to see, if you love like outtakes and that sort of thing, I have this, maybe some of you have come across it, but it's like a companion little, like a book that I made. And it's got lots of pictures from San Francisco in the 20s and pictures of Lang and various outtakes, sort of, bonus tracks from the novel in there. And that's on my website.
Sorry, I was trying to find that too. Anyways, I put the link to the 10 favorite.
Erin, if you go to my contact page, it should be like right at the top.
Okay, I think. Oh yeah, it absolutely is. Okay, so here's the companion guide, and then the other one above that is the favorite books.
Mm.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And thank you so much for your time today. We
Yeah, no,
really
my
appreciate
pleasure.
it. It's always so sweet to hear from the author themselves and what went into kind of, I'm sure, a passion of yours, a work of love. And like I said, we all enjoyed it so much. So thank you, ladies, for joining us tonight. Oh, Nikki has a quick question before
No
we go.
problem. It's okay.
Okay. Mute issues, apologies. So we had talked about, because we're the San Francisco chapter of the book club,
Oh, hi!
about like, hello, about doing, because we talked about this last month, but it's like, oh, this is set in San Francisco. And we were like, oh, okay, well, we need to do something with this. And we talked about, visiting some of the places and like going to Chinatown and that kind of thing. So something we're talking about doing. Are there, and I realized like Monkey Block, you said, where the Trans-America Pyramid now is, and that kind of, and so I guess, is there anything that you think is really like worth checking out now?
Definitely. So I think, so if you go to Jackson Square, do you know where that is?
I don't, but Google knows.
I hadn't been there before, but it's one of the only corners of the city that survived the earthquake. So Jackson Square, right across from Monkey Block, is exactly as it would have been. And Maynard Dixon's studio was on that street. It's not hard to find. I've written Instagram posts, and I think it's also in that guide too, that nonfiction guide that I was mentioning. So I think that's definitely worth it. The businesses are very different than what they were in the Bohemians. Like just the idea that there were artists once is like incredible. I think you could still go to the 920 Sacramento, the Mission Home that has stood there all these years, and it's now it's for social services for Chinese American community, new arrivals. Like they do a lot of really great community outreach, but you could still go to that building where Caroline grew up, so to speak. And you can also go to where Dorothea Lange had her first studio at 540 Sutter Street. That building is actually now, I think there's a bar in it, so you can actually go into it and have a drink. There's no sign, but it's 540 Sutter Street. And all of these places are really close. They're very, very close. North Beach, really similar to what it was. So those are a few ideas, in and around that corner near the Trans-America Pyramid. If you go to the Trans-America Pyramid, not that it's, nothing to necessarily write home about, but there is a plaque that says this is where Montgomery Block stood once. And I think it references some of the artists' names. You could have yourself a nice Pisco punch. Do you know what that is?
I didn't before. I'd never heard of it before. I mean, I know what pisco is, like, because like I've had 6 hours.
Yeah, so Pisco Punch was invented in the basement of Montgomery Block. So where the Trans-America Pyramid is now. It was if you can even imagine this, during gold rush times, it was $25, which is probably like $1,000 now or something like that. And because there was so much money flowing through the city, it was crazy times. And this drink had pineapple, which was such an exotic fruit at that time, but it was sort of, it was just this wild time in San Francisco history where the place was just, flush with money. Anyway, you can have a Pisco punch and think of the old Bohemians.
I shall endeavor to do that. Thank you. So we meet tomorrow and we'll be talking about this. We're making plans for a separate outing to visit some of these locations. So thank you.
You're welcome. And I also, I guess I could also send it to you, but I've done little, posts of, and if you want to visit the Bohemians, here are like some landmarks. Another one would be the Palace Hotel in the Pied Piper bar, the bar there where Maynard and Dory go on their first date. So you could go there and have a Pisco punch and raise a glass.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Very cool question. Thank you, Nikki. And can send me some photos if you guys do venture out.
I love-
Will
I-
do.
Thank you. Again, thank you so much, Jasmin, for your time. And we can't wait to read whatever comes next.
Oh, I appreciate it. And if anyone thinks of a question they didn't have a chance to ask, I'm very easy to find and happy to correspond with you on email.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, people. Thank you, Gloss Club people. Thanks, Kim. Lovely. Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much to you, Erin.